Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Language Testing and Assessment Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Morgan. This week's question is focused on how effective are current testing accommodations for students with specific learning difficulties taking language tests. And we have three guests on the show today to help us find the answer. First is Rachael Blacklaws, a postgraduate student at Leicester University studying testing accommodations. Second is Aiko Nakamura, a Japanese university student with specific learning difficulty currently studying English as her major. And finally, we have Caitlin Baker, a primary school teacher who has been working as a special education needs coordinator for 20 years and who specializes in dyslexia and developmental coordination disorder. Welcome to you all. During today's program, we're going to have four main areas of discussion. First, we're going to define what are specific learning difficulties and testing accommodations. Second, we will move on discussing the current scholarship around testing accommodations. Thirdly, Ms. Nakamura will explain how having a specific learning difficulty impacts her when taking language tests. And in the final session, in the life of the input of Ms. Nakamura, we will discuss what can we conclude about the effectiveness of accommodations on language testing and what this means for future research. So the first question is for Caitlin here. Could you provide a definition of what is meant by specific learning difficulty and how it might affect learning a language?
So the term specific learning difficulty is something of a broad church. We use it to refer to conditions ranging from autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD to speech and language disorders, all conditions which vary widely in their impact on students. However, broadly speaking, it is where one specific aspect of your learning is impaired. This can affect your auditory processing, your working memory, and your receptive and productive language skills. For specific learning difficulties, the rest of your development and IQ will be normal, but you have this one area where your learning is impaired. So if we talk about dyslexia, for example, although dyslexia itself is a very broad spectrum, a student would have problems with phonological processing, namely storing and sequencing sounds. So for a dyslexic student learning English as a foreign language, they could have problems distinguishing between sounds like e and a, and with spelling, because spelling requires the manipulation of phonics. However, each learning difficulty is very specific to each individual student, so it's only possible to talk about conditions in very broad terms.
The next question is for Rachael. Can you give us a brief introduction to where testing accommodations have come from?
Sure. So in the UK, one of the major legislative acts to affect this was the 2001 Special Needs and Disability Act. This act firmly established in law the principle that all students should have equal access to education and provides them with protection from discrimination. That is not just access to classroom education, but also to exams. This has meant that testing organisations not only have a legal responsibility to make their tests accessible for students with disabilities, but also have to ensure their tests are accurately assessing their abilities in order to maintain test validity. This has led to the inclusion of testing accommodations as a standard option in all major testing companies, with ETS alone receiving around 12,000 applications for accommodations each year.
Okay, so can you define what is a testing accommodation?
Broadly speaking, an accommodation is a modification to the test format in order to eliminate construct irrelevant variables. For example, allowing a visually impaired student taking an English vocabulary test to have an assistant read the questions aloud. In this case, the construct the test is measuring is the student's ability to recall vocabulary, and their inability to read the question due to their impairment is not related to this construct. Having an assistant read the questions and transcribe the student's answers would be an accommodation. For a student with a specific learning difficulty, for example dyslexia, an irrelevant variable may be reading time. Dyslexic students often have slower reading time as it takes longer to process and decode words, meaning they may have the same comprehension as a non-dyslexic student, but run out of time and get a lower score. An accommodation for this would be to give dyslexic students extra time to take the test. The accommodations currently listed for the TOEIC test include having a braille or large print testing paper, having extra testing time, either 50% or 100%, having additional rest breaks, having a reader or sign language interpreter, and having a person to write your responses on the answer sheet. These types of accommodations are the most widely used. However, if you examine the research in this area, you'll find there's actually very little consensus about how effective these accommodations are, and there still remains quite a lot of controversy around their use.
Okay, so now we've defined what we're discussing. Rachael, can you provide an overview for us about the current debates within research about testing accommodations?
Of course. Within current scholarship on testing accommodations, there are two main areas of debate about what effect accommodations should have on students and what effect they actually have in practice. The first fundamental debate is between the interaction hypothesis and the differential boost hypothesis. The interaction hypothesis has mainly come from the work of Phillips 1994, and it argues that an accommodation should only benefit the scores of students with learning difficulties and have no effect on students without learning difficulties. The assumption is that if only the scores of students with learning difficulties increase, then this is evidence that an irrelevant variable has been removed. Additionally, Phillips 1994 argues that accommodations which would benefit everyone challenge the validity of the test results. For example, if all student scores would benefit from having extra time, but only students with learning difficulties are given extra time, then you're providing a benefit to one subset of students over another.
And that would undermine the validity of the results, because if all students could have a benefit from the accommodation, then their scores are not comparable with the students with the accommodation.
Exactly. This hypothesis is supported by scholars such as Suresi et al. 2005. They conducted a meta-analysis examining testing accommodations and concluded that extra time improved the scores of all students, not just those with learning difficulties. They went on to argue that it seems more appropriate to give all students more time to take tests, therefore removing the need for accommodations. However, the differential boost hypothesis, developed by Fulcher and Fuchs 1999, argues that accommodations are valid if they provide a benefit to students with learning difficulties, which is significantly greater than the benefit they give to students without a learning difficulty. There have been studies which suggest that students with learning difficulties do benefit significantly more from accommodations than those without, such as Gregg and Nelson 2012, Lang et al. 2008, and Tyndall et al. 1998. These are the two key hypotheses which underpin research about what effect accommodations should have on student scores.
So that's the debate about what effect accommodations should have on student scores. But what do we know about what effect they actually have on student scores?
This is the second fundamental debate within the secondary literature. There is precious little consensus about what effect accommodations actually have on student scores. Some studies, for example Gregg and Nelson 2012, Lang et al. 2008, Crawford and Tyndall 2004, and Johnson et al. 2001, have found support for the differential boost hypotheses by showing that the scores of students with learning difficulties were more significantly increased than those without. But others have found the opposite. Lewandowski, Hendricks and Gordon 2015, Elliott and Marquardt 2004, McKevin and Elliott 2003, and Fulcher et al. 2000 are all studies that found accommodations either had no effect on student scores, or that students with learning difficulties and students without learning difficulties benefited the same. As part of my research, I collected and examined the results of 23 studies into testing accommodations, conducted between 1997 and 2015. Of these, only 6 of them showed support for either the interaction hypotheses or the differential boost hypotheses.
Only 6?
There was quite a large variation in the other results. 10 studies showed that accommodations affected all students equally, or at least without a significant impact on the scores of students with learning difficulties. There were 2 studies that showed inconclusive results, 2 studies that showed that non-disabled students actually benefited more from the accommodations, and 1 study that showed the accommodations had a negative effect on students with specific learning difficulties. Additionally, a further 2 studies by Koretz and Hamilton 2000 and Koretz 1997 concluded that the accommodations provided in those cases were invalid because the scores of students with learning difficulties were implausibly high.
For a full list of the studies Rachael is discussing, please see our production notes, section 2, available for download. Rachael, why do you think the results of these studies are so inconclusive?
Well, there appear to be 3 major problems within current scholarship into testing accommodations that suggest why there have been so many different results. The first is that studies tend to vary a lot in who and what they are testing, making it very difficult to generalize across results and check for reliability. For example, from the 23 studies I identified, 8 were exclusively looking into reading aloud as an accommodation. Within these 8 studies, only 3 looked at its impact on a reading test. And within those 3 studies, only 2 were looking at elementary school students of a similar age, and they both found different results. This is just one example of how within such a vast field, research that can be compared is difficult to find. Indeed, when Gregg and Nelson 2012 conducted a meta-analysis focusing on the impact of extra time, they could only identify 9 studies that could be compared. The area of testing accommodations as a whole is one that would benefit greatly from more replication studies, so that more reliable results can be found. Additionally, it's significant to note that research into the impact of testing accommodations on students taking language tests is practically non-existent. All the studies already discussed have been conducted on American students taking standardized statewide tests. The vast majority English L1 speakers taking tests in English. While there are some studies, like ABERDEE 2009, which look at accommodations for English language learners taking school tests, the area of accommodations for non-English L1 speakers with learning difficulties taking English language tests remains unresearched.
I see. And what about the second major issue?
The second major issue with the current scholarship is that there is often not enough effort made within studies to distinguish between the different learning profiles of students.
Caitlin, would you be able to describe why that's a problem?
Yes, so as I highlighted earlier, learning difficulties vary widely even within the same diagnosis. For example, you can have a student with dyslexia who can read quite fluently but can't comprehend what it is they've read, while at the same time you can have another student with dyslexia who can understand the passage if it's read to them but can't read it themselves, meaning a read aloud accommodation may be beneficial to one but not the other, which would affect the test results. And if you have a study that is simply classifying all students as having various learning difficulties, that's going to cover a multitude of specific learning problems. Any study that claims to be studying students with learning difficulties in general runs the risk of being overly prescriptive in its conclusions.
Yes, this is actually very common in studies on accommodations, where the participants are classified as having learning disabilities or reading disabilities in general. More recently, there have been efforts in the scholarship to distinguish more between the learning difficulties of the students studied. There have been studies focusing on ADHD, for example, Lewandowski, Hendricks and Gordon 2015, who have looked at the impact of extra time on this group of students and concluded that extra time made no difference. This is one possible answer as to why the results of many studies are contradictory. Different accommodations may impact students with different learning difficulties differently, and studies that discuss all students with learning difficulties as a singular group are going to find their results are inconsistent.
What would the third major problem be?
The third major problem is that the voices and experiences of the students themselves are missing from these studies. Of the 23 studies I previously talked about, only 5 of them included student feedback about the accommodations used. There appears to be a disconnect in the way accommodations are delivered, coming from the testing authorities down rather from the input and needs of individual students. But whether it's possible for large testing organisations like ETS to deliver such individualised tests for students remains to be seen.
Well, that was a very comprehensive overview on the current scholarships on accommodations. Next, we will move on to the third section, where Ms. Aiko Nakamura will talk about her experience on language testing. Ms. Nakamura, could you talk a little about your diagnosis and how it affects you?
Of course, so I was diagnosed with congenital language disorder around 1 month ago. It's a disorder that affects my working memory and my receptive and productive language skills in particular. For example, one problem I have always had is being able to remember what people have just said to me. My parents used to get angry with me because I just couldn't listen and remember what they were saying to me, literally in one ear and one out of the other. It was the same in class. When my teacher was explaining something for a long time, I just couldn't understand and I couldn't follow along. In a way, I think that's why I liked studying English so much. Because when people spoke to me in shorter, simpler sentences, it was easier for me to understand what they were saying than when people spoke to me in Japanese. I also find reading long passages difficult. I can understand the individual words, but it's very difficult if I don't have pictures to go with it to match those words together in my mind to know what the passage means. I also have problems with concentrating for long periods of time. I think my maximum is around 50 minutes before I need to take a break. If I'm having to concentrate for longer than that, my mind really starts to lose focus and think about anything else. And I always found writing in English to be difficult because I can't remember the vocabulary. At school, we always had to memorize long lists of words and just found that really difficult.
So, what language tests have you taken?
I've taken the TOEIC test maybe 5 or 6 times now because I was only diagnosed recently. I've never taken it with an accommodation. I've only just started using accommodations in my class tests.
What aspects of the test do you find challenging, and how do you think that relates to your learning difficulty?
Well, the reading section is my worst one. I always got around 290 points for the listening, but only around 90 for the reading section. So like I said, if the test is very long and I can't take a break of just 5 or 10 minutes in the middle, I can't keep up my concentration level. Also, it's difficult for me to remember what I've just read. I read the paragraph, then I read the question, but then I forgot what the paragraph said. So I read the paragraph again, but then I forgot the question, so I go back. Basically, I take the test like this. Then I run out of time and I have to guess a lot of answers. I used to think it was because I was stupid. That's what my teachers used to say, but now the doctor said it's cognitive language disorder. I feel more confidence. It's not that I'm stupid. My brain just works in a different way to other people.
So, what kinds of accommodations have you been using in class? And what would you like to use in the TOEIC test next time?
Well, one of my teachers gave me a paper with a square cut out of it, so when I put it on the test paper, I can only see one sentence at a time. That helps a lot when I'm reading, because it helps me focus on each sentence, but it means I'm all very slow. So I want to be able to use my paper in the test.
That was Ayoko Nakamura discussing how her specific learning difficulty impacts her testing experience. So in light of what we just heard, Caitlin and Rachel, what do you think we can say about the effectiveness of testing accommodations?
Well, the first thing that came across to me was her positive attitude towards test accommodations, and this is something that's consistent with the existing literature. Of the 5 studies that included student feedback about testing accommodations, all showed that a majority of students with and without learning difficulties liked having accommodations. Indeed, Elliott and Marquardt 2004 found that even though most students didn't use most of their allotted extra time, they still preferred taking the test with it, which might suggest some placebo effect for having accommodations.
Well, a lot of what Aiko said was very illustrative of the disabling effects of having a learning difficulty. Consistently having such a large difference between her listening and reading scores is demonstrative of having a better understanding than she's able to express in the test. The fact that she's capable of scoring 200 points more in the listening than reading would tell me as a teacher that some aspect of the reading section is not allowing her to show her true understanding of English. There is some construct irrelevant variable going on.
What was also striking to me was the fact that her working memory problems seemed to be affecting her reading more than her listening. Based on the label congenital language disorder, I would have suggested an accommodation like pausing the listening CD during the test. This to me is another example of how without input from individual students, the accommodations offered them based on their diagnosis may not be what they need. Also, it's evidence of how combinations of accommodations are also important. Studying the effect of just one accommodation might not produce a significant impact on students' scores, because in reality, they need that combined with others. So, for example, allowing Aiko extra time in her test might not increase her score significantly, because she also needs the accommodation of using her overlay paper to assist her reading.
But for me, there is also a much bigger picture at play here, which is about the nature of education and qualifications in general. I would describe testing accommodations as very blunt instruments whereby you're trying to create a broad, general response to something that's so individual specific. I would argue that rather than having these one-size-fits-all tests, it should be the other way round, and you should be starting from thinking about what the individual person's needs are and designing a test that allows them to show you what they understand about something.
Well, in an ideal world, yes, that would be true. But surely impractical for companies that design language tests that need to be able to be administered to thousands of people with scores that are valid and reliable.
Well, from the perspective of an educator and someone who's been teaching children with specific learning difficulties, what these accommodations are doing a lot of the time is providing a quick fix. You can make changes to the test format and include accommodations to allow more people to access the test, but you are still assessing non-neurotypical students on their ability to process information in a neurotypical way. As Aiko described, her working memory impairment affected her in the test in the reading section, where she struggled to remember the information in the paragraph she just read, and none of the accommodations typically offered by exam boards would be able to help her with that. When you read studies of dyslexia and other learning difficulties that use MRI scans of brains, you can see how the language parts of the brain light up differently in dyslexic and non-dyslexic people. The way they process certain types of information is fundamentally different, and what we ask these students to do in tests can't simply be equalised with accommodations. When people talk about removing construct irrelevant variables, for a lot of students you're not even close to levelling the playing field.
Well, this all comes back again to the issue of accommodations for physical disabilities versus accommodations for specific learning difficulties. Because there would be some scholars, like Elliott and Marquardt 2004, who would argue that it's impossible to create a level playing field because the construct the test is measuring is so close to the student's learning difficulty. A vocabulary test is testing your ability to memorise, process and retrieve words from your memory. And if your working memory is something that's affected by your learning difficulty, that's not something that could be accommodated easily. The assumption behind many of the studies previously discussed is that with the correct modification to the test format, the scores of students with learning difficulties will be comparable to those without, yet it doesn't seem that this will necessarily be the case.
So, would you then agree that testing accommodations have no value?
I wouldn't go so far as that, because from the research we have, there is some evidence that some accommodations in some situations do have a positive effect on student scores. And there's also survey evidence that students have a better test-taking experience when they have accommodations. However, there need to be more serious discussions by researchers, test designers and test takers about what the accommodations are there to do and what they can do while the fundamental nature of testing remains unchanged.
What would you suggest would be the necessary steps to take into the future?
Well, first of all, there needs to be more research into accommodations and language testing specifically, and whether the effects of accommodations can be compared to the results of other studies. Secondly, more replication studies need to be conducted into accommodations, so it's possible to find more reliable, comparable results. Thirdly, there needs to be a discussion by test designers about whether it's possible to design a test whose construct does not necessarily exclude non-neurotypical students.
Well, to conclude our discussion here today, it seems that the world of testing accommodations is more complex than it first appears, with debate ranging from the purpose of individual accommodations to the fundamental nature of how we test people. This is a field with a lot of research, a lot of questions, but not nearly enough answers. I would like to thank my three guests for appearing here today and you for listening to today's episode. Thank you and goodbye.